All right, well, it's 11:01, so we are going to get started. Thank you all for joining us. Today, we are having a special webinar on communication skills. This is one of the most requested skills in our leadership competency framework, so you're in for a treat. My name is Helen. For those of you who haven't seen my name pop up in your emails, I am the marketing coordinator at Sigma Assessment Systems. We are a professional service firm that offers talent development, succession planning, and a lot of psychological assessments for organizations who are looking to build their internal talent pools. Sigma has been in business for over 50 years. So as a company, we have a lot of experience, and we're looking forward to sharing some of that with you today. We have about 60 minutes together, so a little bit of housekeeping. For the first 45 minutes or so, my colleague Hiten will take you through our webinar content to introduce communication skills to you. We will be recording the session, and you will receive a follow-up email with access to both the recording and the slides, so no need to take frantic notes. As we go, feel free to post questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your webinar bar. We will take a look at those throughout, and at the end of the session, we'll leave about 10 minutes to answer those questions together and also answer any questions that come up live. If there's anything that we don't get to in our webinar, you can send us an email. We're always available to follow up, and our consultants are happy to chat. But for now, don't be shy, use the Q&A. That's what it's there for. And we are looking forward to learning together. All right, now without any further ado, let me introduce you to my colleague Hiten. Hiten is a PhD candidate in personality and measurement at Western University. His research portfolio includes psychrometrics, test construction, emotional intelligence, and various other individual difference factors implicated in both educational and vocational success. Hiten has also taught various undergraduate courses at the University of Western. At Sigma, Hiten brings his knowledge of evidence-based practices to his role on the research and development team, and he specializes in assessment, validation, and technical documentation. He also supports our educational offerings, such as this webinar today. So Hiten, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Helen. Appreciate it a lot. And thank you, everyone, for taking an hour of your day to come to this webinar. I hope it's a good use of your time. Today, we're going to talk about communication. And just to set the table a little bit here, these will be the main topic areas that we cover. So first, we'll introduce communication, explaining why it's important for us as working professionals, what effective communication looks like, as well as some common challenges that we face that can hamper our communication with others in the workplace. And then we'll do a deep dive into what people refer to as the 3 pillars of communication, namely listening, speaking, nonverbal cues as well. What to pay attention to, how we can improve them, as well as how the pillars need to be viewed together in order to make meaningful gains in communication skill. So before we begin, I want to hear from you. So we're going to do an audience poll question. In the last year, how often have you felt unheard, misguided, or disappointed due to poor communication in the workplace? I believe Helen has the options coming up on the screen in just a bit here. Take some time to answer. And whenever's good, we can take a look at the distribution of responses. All right, so 71% of you selected sometimes, and enough of you selected frequently and almost always, to where we can determine that, hey, this is an issue, right? It's a very important question because a lot of employees tend to feel unheard. They tend to feel as though they don't have a voice. A quick look at the research suggests that only 1/3 of essential workers feel that they're able to freely express themselves and their views and their thoughts to their manager. And essential workers in UK, Canada, and the US in particular feel the least heard in the world. And that can sometimes fuel counterproductive workplace behaviors, as well as high turnover. One of my friends, for example, works at a warehouse, spent a whole summer complaining to me about the heat in the building that she works in, how she's come close to having heat stroke on numerous occasions, how she feels like her attempts to rectify this issue with her manager didn't work out. And she developed a very antagonistic relationship with her manager. She didn't feel heard, and eventually she started looking at legal options for either how she could get out of there or even file a suit against her company. So that's not a good thing for any workplace, right? So let's unpack some of the ways some of the things that can happen as a result of good communication, what good communication can foster, and how it can help mitigate uh, problems that like I talked about, and maybe some things that you've potentially gone through at your workplace. And I'll start with employee engagement. So effective communication can make your workers feel heard and valued, which goes a long way toward making them feel a sense of dignity, belonging, and feeling heard in the workplace. As a result, they're going to be more engaged. In fact, over 90% of engaged employees feel heard in their workplace, while only 30% of disengaged employees tend to feel heard. And financially successful companies tend to have over 20% more employees who feel heard compared to financially underperforming companies. And that should provide a compelling reason for us to invest in the development of communication skills. One of the big talking points in economic circles these days is the great resignation, right? Workers leaving their positions in droves, companies struggling with staffing key positions in the last few years. And while there are many factors playing into this, including wages and salaries, the precipitants of it are often multifaceted. And one of the key reasons that people are resigning is because they feel a lack of dignity in their workplace, right? Communication from the top down is very poor, and it can make work feel meaningless. So we have to take steps in order to prevent that. Better communication also leads to better problem solving, right? Every organization tends to face challenges, but have you ever been in a situation, for example, where a minor misunderstanding snowballs into a major issue, right? Where you're frustrated with your boss or a colleague, but you just let little things tend to build up because you either think they're not important to address or you feel no one's going to listen to you anyway, right? This tends to happen a lot. And a direct consequence of this is you start to have very vague, ambiguous conversations, and you just kind of want to, you know, get through talking to your manager so you can just kind of privately focus on your work. On the other hand, when there's good communication, when you feel comfortable talking to your managers and to your colleagues, and when you look forward to it, you're going to find that you're on the same page more often than not. You tend to make better decisions, and you also have the freedom to pitch novel ideas to them and work on new ideas, right? You're not just going through the motions during meetings anymore. In fact, the meetings are more productive and they're actually leading somewhere. And that's a really good feeling. Another important outcome of good communication is better teams, right? A lot of us, I imagine, work in teams to some capacity or another. Give an example of a sports team, for example. Obviously, with sports like football or hockey, teamwork is necessarily involved. Without good teamwork, you're not going to win. But even individual sports, think like golf or tennis, for example. I'm a huge tennis fan. Um, and very often with tennis, we just see the one player or two players in the case of doubles, doing their thing on the court. But there's usually a whole team behind them, right? They've got a head coach, an assistant coach, a physiotherapist, a sports psychologist, maybe even an analyst or a statistician. They're all working together, and they all have to be on the same page, both with each other and with the player, in order to draw success, especially if they're going to win big tournaments. And sometimes even the family plays a key role in that, and significant others, etc. So it's important to keep this in mind when thinking about good communication. And just to continue on this topic of teams, one of the key factors that underlie good teamwork is this thing called trust, right? Especially when people in general feel comfortable talking honestly with you. It's when they trust you. Now there's a difference between reliability and trust here, right? Reliability, workers who or employees who get stuff done, they come on time, they're punctual, right? It's a good indicator of productive workplace behavior, and it's fantastic. But it's often not necessarily associated with being trustworthy, right? Sometimes you can have a lot of reliable dingbats, but trust goes a level above that and it requires good communication. Research shows that we speak thousands of words a day, and a lot of that time we don't even remember much or put much thought into our words. We're just kind of going through the motions, right? Now, I'm not suggesting that you spend 100% emotional energy into every single word you use and just script out your conversations every day. Obviously, that's going to be counterproductive, but just think of it as there's still thousands of opportunities for you to build trust and rapport with someone, right? So even if we can capitalize on, I don't know, maybe half of that, quarter of that, a third of that, it'll go a long way toward building better relationships, right? So when you talk to people, think about building trust and encouraging transparency both ways, right? We often just talk to convey information to just kind of get something through to someone and then go about with our day. But if we're in positions of power, especially, we need to strive to make sure that the people who work under us feel comfortable talking to us openly. Then this process will eventually foster a mutual respect for one another. It'll keep us in sync with our mutual goals. And that's really important if you're going to, for example, respect boundaries. Like how do you know when it's a good time to add more work onto someone's plate, right? Does your employee trust you enough to say, hey, yeah, I have a bit more availability this week if you would like support on another task, for example, right? Or are they a bit more closed off? Are they comfortable offering alternative ideas and strategies to you, alternatives to maybe getting the same task done? Right? These are crucial questions to ask in teamwork, and trust is a fundamental feature that defines good teams. And the final major point on the importance of effective communication here is less time wasting, right? When your first message or your first meeting with someone contains all the fundamentals of good communication, you'll spend a lot less time on follow-up calls, follow-up emails, right? The modern workforce spends about around 25% of their time reading, responding to emails, right? Imagine if we could shorten that a little, maybe if we could half that, right? We'd save a lot of time and we could put that time into actually getting work done, right? So really important to have effective communication. And I just want to conclude with a quote here. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. George Bernard Shaw, a renowned playwright, said this, and I think it's really worth repeating here. We're often not aware of our bad communication practices. I've been in a lot of leadership positions in my career thus far, be it as a teaching assistant, a professor, a volunteer group leader. I've been made aware of issues that have built up over several weeks, several months. And this has happened to me in friendships and relationships as well, right? Very often I thought I was getting the job done with my announcements, my instructions, or, in the context of interpersonal relationships, Discord messages, because that's how we kids communicate these days. But very often I found that I had failed, right? I was not as attuned to the needs of the people that I had to talk to. And I was always under the illusion that I had properly communicated with them. So it's important to kind of touch base and recenter on, am I an effective communicator? Or how can I do better even if I'm doing a decent job so far? So how can we recognize good communication then, right? How do we know that we've properly conveyed our points and that we've actually listened to other people, right? We'll explore that in the next section here. And the first concept to keep in mind when you want to communicate effectively is the clarity and the conciseness of your message. In a lot of workplaces, you are bound to find someone who talks so much yet says so little. You sometimes might just sit through a long-winded speech and wonder, "Well, what was the point of that?" Right? I remember going to a psychology convention a couple of years back that was open to the public, and researchers were presenting their work to members of a lay audience who they were there to learn about mental health and resilience. And it was a good experience overall, but One of the talks I attended that I found really interesting was on psychogeography, and just that name, it's very inherently interesting. And the speaker, who had just finished her PhD, went into a lot of detail about her research and spent half the talk explaining the statistical methods of her studies. And I found that fascinating, but that was not what a lot of the audience was there for. I felt bad for her at the end when she opened it up to questions, and very few people had questions at the end. Um, Brilliant mind, but at that point, it's as though she was defending her thesis, and the audience just wasn't there for a thesis defense. So in order to be an effective communicator, you need to respect your audience's time. You need to be direct, be specific, avoid needless jargon, get right to the point. I could sit here right now and give you an intricate explanation of several meta analyses on communication styles, but that'd be a waste of time, right? When you talk to someone, you need to ensure that the crux of your message is understood. And that goes for public speaking as well as just general day-to-day interactions in your workplace. You need to give minimal room for misinterpretation and ambiguity. The next component of effective communication is being transparent and truthful, right? When you look at the research on positive workplace behavior, something that comes up a lot but isn't talked about much is honesty and sincerity. We touched earlier on this concept of trust, right? It is the foundation of all great relationships. And the way you're going to achieve that is through transparency, whether you're delivering good news or having to address a difficult topic. Last year, I taught an abnormal psych class, and it happened to overlap with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? Super scary time, February of 2022. Global nuclear annihilation was on everyone's mind, even more so than it is now. And I took 10 minutes at the beginning just to discuss the topic openly, inviting people to share their thoughts, their anxieties, basically acknowledging this giant elephant in the room that was on a lot of people's minds before we proceeded with the class. And I got good feedback for that, especially from students with Eastern European relatives. They appreciated that we addressed a major catastrophe that was impacting their mental health right now before we then moved on to a lecture on just general mental health, right? So while I'm not advocating that you turn all your board meetings into icebreakers or discussions of geopolitics, don't be shy to bring up a difficult topic. When the situation warrants it, right? Especially if you know that's where most of your employees' minds are at. Something that could be happening internally, such as, I don't know, maybe your company had several major senior level resignations, right? And your employees deserve to ask questions about that, and they deserve to receive on that authentic but professional answers to it. So again, try to be truthful, try to be transparent, address the elephant in the room. Next important feature of communication is the back and forth nature of it. I know it's a little ironic for me right now to just sit here and monologue to you for about an hour on communication and bring up the fact that it should be back and forth, but really it ought to be, right? Communication is like a feedback loop. If it's your job to give instruction to someone, your goal is not only to send the message, but also to ensure that it has been received and properly understood, that you don't seem closed off to responses. Right? Lines in an email like, please let me know if you have any questions, or I'd be repetitive, maybe redundant, but they can make a tangible difference in how approachable you come across, especially if you're just talking to someone for the first time. And when people, they don't feel as though they wasted their time, right? Soak in their questions, reflect on some of their concerns, communicate understanding and provide the kind of response that you would want if you had similar concerns. So we'll touch on the concept of listening, specifically active listening later on in this presentation, where we'll cover some strategies you can use to do this. All right, so we've covered the importance of effective communication and what effective communication looks like. Now let's get into some barriers that might hamper good communication. So we touched on earlier about, how good communicators minimize jargon. It's worth reiterating that point here too, right? You don't want to be in a conversation where you feel like, or the other person feels like they need to look up words. even if you're both speaking the same language that you're fluent in, right? Using jargon or technical language that's not universally understood can alienate your listener, and it can alienate them very quickly. So I'll just sort of restart on the slide then, right? Another barrier that uh, that can impede communication, other than poor internet, is um, lots of when you drown your audience members in too much jargon, for example, and when you don't emphasize your main point. You got to remember that members of your audience, they have their own lives, they have their own distractions, and especially with the internet these days, we get a lot more information thrown at us than we even know what to do with ourselves, right? So learn how to prioritize your main points. Don't turn your your talk or your presentation into a slog. Don't make it feel like talking to you is work, right? Distill your message so that you can prioritize what's truly important and avoid drowning your colleagues in irrelevant and non-important details. Another barrier that we often see when employers don't have good social cultural understanding. With market globalization these days, we now have a more interconnected world and increasing levels of diversity in the workplace. You are going to interact with colleagues from a range of different backgrounds, and that's a wonderful thing. But remember, many of them probably aren't going to be able to relate to even a regular water cooler conversation about white suburban upbringing. And different cultures also have different communication styles. For example, while we here in the West usually take nodding as a sign of understanding, right? People in other cultures nod to convey that they're listening to you. And the gesture doesn't have as much bearing on their ability to actually understand what you're saying, right? In addition, things like handshakes aren't as common or encouraged in some cultures either. It's important to be respectful of this and develop cultural literacy and competency within your workplace. And something else that may hamper communication is general distractions, whether they are distracting you or your listener. Have you ever had a conversation with someone, for example, at like 4 p.m. on a workday, and in your mind, all you're thinking about is, what you're going to have for dinner that night? What about going into a conversation so overexcited and with such strong conviction that you're just waiting to unload all your brilliant talking points all over the listener, right? That can lead us to form opinions without actually hearing all of what the other person has to say. We only pay attention to a part of it, and we may end up just dismissing their views as a result. So it's important to be mindful of these internal distractions when you go into a meeting. And then there are also circumstances beyond our control, right? Where are you having this conversation or this meeting? If it's online, what's the connection quality like? I just dropped my internet right now. Maybe that distracted some of you to the point where reestablishing attention is going to be a lot more difficult, right? Make sure that you take stock, even if you can't control your connection quality, at least take stock of it. And like I'm doing now, acknowledge that elephant in the room, right? Or if you're having an in-person meeting, what's going on around you while you're talking? Are you in a busy restaurant? Are you in a three-piece suit standing outside in the middle of July, right? You can take stock of these factors, and you might then be able to do things like suggest a different meeting location or even a different time, right? You might also want to petition for better seating if that's possible. A lot of things you can do as long as you take stock of the distractors. And lastly, I want to touch on emotional barriers, right? We're all aware and have experienced emotions clouding our judgment. You may have gone into conversations with people who have wronged you in the past. Someone you may have formed an opinion on way too prematurely, or you're about to have an important meeting on a really bad day. Now imagine if you have to have an uncomfortable conversation with this colleague, right? Where you have to work through disagreements. If you go in with this negative emotional baggage, you could end up strawmanning their points when it's your turn to speak. In other words, you distort their claim to such an extreme position that they didn't intend. You strip their points of all their nuance, but it makes it easier for you to argue back against, right? And some people do this intentionally, there's going to be dishonest actors everywhere, but many people don't realize that they're doing this. Their capacity to listen and digest the conflicting viewpoint is just hampered by these pre-existing emotional barriers, a personal bias, past experience. I don't like this person that I have to work with now, right? And the least you can do for emotional barriers is at least acknowledge their existence so that you can at least try to take the other person's points at their merit without resorting to personal ad hominem attacks. All right, so now we've explored what good communication looks like, why it's important, and some barriers to effective communication. Now let's dive into some of its main facets. While we often focus on speaking, listening, and understanding nonverbal, while we often focus on speaking, I should say, listening is also important, as well as nonverbal cues. And it's something that we often overlook. So let's break down each of these elements and explore how they intertwine. And we'll start with listening. Right. So one of the best things you can do, one of the things you're doing right now with my camera off is listening, right? And to make your conversation partner feel genuinely heard, you have to actively listen to them. Instead of just listening to talk, you need to try and listen to understand or listen to connect with the other person. Right. So how do we do this? First, we need to look beyond our own worldview of things, right? I teach I'll mention I've taught some undergrad courses before, and a lot of students sometimes come to lectures with the mindset of, okay, what does this mean to me, right? Will this be on the exam, right? This thing on the syllabus, etc. And they're not thinking, how is the professor feeling about this, right? What made him so interested in talking to us about antidepressants today, right? And for the context of a monologuing presentation, and really the context of education, that's fine. It's not a bad thing to think, what's in it for me when you go into communication. But when you're communicating at work and trying to build good relationships, you also need to focus on the other person, right? What does this mean to them? And a good way to practice this is by reflecting on what the speaker says and asking clarifying questions, right? So words like, what I'm hearing you say is, can you please elaborate on? Phrases like these carry a lot of power. I promise you, if they're passionate about what they're talking about, they will love it if you reflect their points and ask insightful follow-up questions. They'll be thankful for it. So to round out the section on active listening, remember that you have 2 ears and one mouth. Practice active listening more than you speak. Give the other person the space they need to speak authentically to you and reward them for their contribution to the conversation. You can actually practice something like this today. So if I can give you a bit of homework today, after the presentation, if you have a lunch break at work or when you go home, go to a colleague, a friend, or a family member, right? And tell them, hey, I've got this active listening exercise. I was at a webinar by Sigma today, and I want to practice this with you. And I've even done this with a shopkeeper once, actually, when when it wasn't busy. Go up to them and ask them and tell them to tell you about an accomplishment of theirs for about 90 seconds or so, whether it's a new job or even something simple like, oh, I got my cats to use the litter box today, right? Anything they're comfortable sharing, little small wins. And when they talk, really try and pay attention for like 90 seconds and try to reflect their points and their feelings at the end. And maybe also generate some follow-up questions to keep it going a little longer. It's a good exercise and one we probably would do if this were an active in-person workshop. But it's really something, to practice on our own in our day-to-day life, and it'll really build these listening muscles. So remember, active listening, really important. And before you talk, think, why am I talking? All right, now let's move on to speaking. And before we dive into some of the details, let's do another poll question here, right? We spent a lot of time in this presentation talking about effective communication. So when talking to someone, which of the following is most important or should you strive for most in your message? Truthfulness, helpfulness, informativeness, necessity of the information you convey, and kindness. So pick whichever one you think is most important. We'll give you a few seconds to vote. Hey, Helen, if we could see the answers. All right, so lots of distribution here. Truthfulness, helpfulness, and informativeness kind of tying at around 41, 41, 47% each. Not so much in necessity, not so much in kindness. That's interesting. So this was a bit of a trick question. The correct answer is, of course, all of them, right? All of these components are equally important, with some probably taking precedence in different circumstances. So maybe when you voted on these, you thought about specific, conversational contexts, but none of these really can be ignored when you're delivering a message. So I don't want to spend too much time on this slide since the early part of the presentation already covered a lot of these key points, but we'll tie some of the main ingredients here together. So whether we're giving a speech to an audience or just talking to a colleague, a lot of professionals struggle with talking. Sometimes you're too vague, other times you belabor a point or you overwhelm with needless details. It's important to keep some of these speaking pain points in mind before we talk, right? So how can we improve our speaking then? You may have heard of the common expression, think before you speak, right? In the previous poll question, we zoned in on the word think to create an acronym for 5 important elements of speech. Is my message true, helpful, informative, necessary, and kind? Right? So let's start with true. Are you being sincere with your listeners? Remember that concept of sincerity, right? Are you addressing the elephant in the room? Are you providing authentic answers to their questions? It's also important to reemphasize that you shouldn't have a hidden agenda when you go into meetings. When you are transparent with your listener, it will make meetings a lot more productive and a lot more meaningful. Are you being helpful? Right? When you're explaining a task to someone, are you providing helpful information? It's really easy sometimes when you yourself have done a task so many times to take certain things for granted or certain bits of knowledge for granted. We all do it. But think back to when you first did the task and what information you needed then, right? Put yourself in your employee's shoes. What can you say that is going to be helpful for them right now? Sometimes your listener may just answer this for you if you aren't just talking over them. Does your message have the right balance of being informative and necessary? These two are often a very delicate mix, right? People tended to prefer informative more than necessary in our poll question here. I'll give you a, a brief anecdote on this. I remember going to an open house viewing one day. I was in Peterborough, Ontario, Trent University, where I did my undergrad education, and the landlord was taking me around this house. It was a great house. It was right by the river, had a nice dock, really excellent. And he spent a lot of time discussing the history of the property, the previous owners, not owners, the renters, I should say, and even a long-winded explanation about how air conditioners work. And while it was all fascinating, I didn't need all that information, honestly. And what I was most interested in really was the state of the place right now, as well as the current regulations about renting that unit. I had just made enough time in between classes to go visit that. By the end of that tour, I didn't have enough time to get through all my questions before his next viewing. So I had to ask them in a follow-up email. If you're dealing with customers, remember that a lot of customers don't write in follow-up questions. You need to use your first meeting, your first point of contact with them to give them the relevant and necessary information that they need and make adequate time for their questions. And in the context of a workplace, think about how a sudden info dump can impact your colleagues' current work as well as their goals. Is your information helping them with their current work? If you're working, for example, with spreadsheets, do they need to know the details about this new data set that they're probably not going to work on for the next 6 months, right? What information would be more useful for them right now? What I like to do is keep a log of updates as they come in, and I establish a sort of routine of information sharing with my colleagues so that none of us feels out of the loop. This routine tends to be different for each colleague that I work with because everyone has a different workflow style. This way, we avoid holding on to a big load of necessary information that we just then dump in each other's lap at a later point. It's better to share information in frequent small doses than a large oversharing of information at a later point. And people voted least for kind. I'll emphasize Yes, we sometimes have to have difficult conversations, but you can't afford to lose your empathy, right? You need to put yourself in your listener's shoes and think about how you would receive the message if it were you on the other side, right? If you're giving feedback, make sure you lead with the positives before you get into the negatives. Remember the emotional barriers to communication, right? Take stock of any that you might have. Try not to strawman your colleague as we discussed previously. Instead, steelman their points, right? Or in other words, interpret their comments as good faith arguments in the best possible light, even if you still end up disagreeing with them. This way, you'll at least have taken the best possible interpretation of their point and at least provided pushback on that instead of completely dismissing and stripping all the nuance from what they're communicating with you. And this sort of honest engagement is the foundation of good speaking, in addition to being clear and concise. All right, so we've covered listening and speaking. Now let's talk about nonverbal cues. There's so much that goes into a conversation that we don't even consciously pay attention to, but they have a profound impact on our understanding nonetheless, right? Why is my professor raising an eyebrow when I convey a research topic? Why is my boss's position in their seat changing when I bring up a technical issue? Why did my colleague's tone of voice shift when I talked about my promotion, right? Nonverbal cues often act as a mirror for our internal feelings, and they can be either a gift or a liability for social interaction. When you're in tune with and in control of your nonverbal gestures, they can leak into your conversation. For example, remember when we talked about having distractions, right, during meetings, etc.? Whether you're thinking about an argument that maybe you had with your partner last night, or how you don't like your colleague's shoes, or the textures of the chair you're sitting on, your face might start to grimace a little and your position might start to shift the more you think about it. So really focus on how you're saying it, right? Because what you can say can be very different from how you're saying it. A classic example that I'm sure all of you can relate to, I remember being at a family dinner several years back, and one of my younger cousins spilled some food onto the tablecloth and he just kept munching away. His mom, my aunt, looked at him uncomfortably for a while as he continued munching away at the fried rice, and his mom's like, can you clean that up, please? Right? In a tone that brought this really awkward silence to the table for a while. And you see, as I say that, right, the words, can you clean that up, please, are very different from, can you clean that up, please? Right? The latter just commands this attention that it probably shouldn't command, and it completely outweighs the words that are being used. And this can happen in the workplace as well. So how can we be more in tune with our nonverbal gestures? There's a few things you can do to take control of your nonverbal gestures. Um, Before meetings, maybe try to find a moment to yourself to take a deep breath, focus your attention on the conversation at hand, and find a you know, calm composure in your body language and facial expressions. Just before this presentation, in fact, I did a 5-minute mindfulness meditation video just to kind of reorient my thinking. And this is especially important when you're feeling frustrated, anxious, overwhelmed, right? Because the nonverbal cues associated with stress can conflict with what you're trying to communicate with other people. And you can also pause to just take stock of posture, facial expression, body language. Try to do that on a semi-regular basis. Try recording yourself during a speech, for example, and just audit your nonverbal cues. Make a conscious effort to relax your posture or expressions and demonstrate your calm composure. Again, I find mindfulness meditation and posture exercises, office yoga, they can be really helpful for this. We do this, in fact, in Sigma about like a couple times a week. And look for positive examples as well of good communicators in your company. I'm not saying that you should, try and just bootlick or just completely copy someone else, but try and take positives from some of the better communicators and see if you can mirror some of their body language. And remember also, we've talked about nonverbal gestures. Different cultures also place different meanings on certain gestures, and mental health can also impact people's nonverbal communication. So when it's you that's doing the the judging. And when it's you that's doing the listening, try not to overanalyze the person you're talking to. Sometimes it's perfectly fine to just take them at their word. So we've talked about each of these three components. Remember, consider these skills not only individually, but also how they can be used together, right? For example, listening, I would say, really very much the foundation of it all. Without listening, you've lost half the battle in communication, right? But with listening has to come good speaking and an understanding of nonverbal cues as well. Before you say, I do most of my communication through written text, I don't need to know about nonverbal cues. Well, not so fast, right? A lot of these tips here can apply to email communication as well. So let's start with nonverbal cues. So what can this look like in email communication or written text? Well, punctuation, spelling, various other text-based cues, right? That can mirror the tone of what you write. And there's ways of writing things that can convey your emotions without really having to be very explicit about your emotions in the words you use. Similarly, you can be a good listener in written conversations too. Instead of using your ears, use your eyes to read carefully, digest the other person's points, consider their needs before you respond. This is especially important in live chat where sometimes we feel the impulse to just type, right? If you use live chat features a lot, my advice is to use a software that shows you when the other person is typing so that you don't just post right over them, because that's not going to lead to good communication at all. And even when quote unquote speaking here, right, or writing, it's important again to be clear and concise. Be mindful of who needs to hear what. Ensure that important updates are being sent to the right people at the right time. Think of who needs to be included in each email, right? So no matter how you're talking, whether it's verbal communication, having in-person meetings, or whether a lot of your communication happens via email, there's a lot of things that we can still do to improve our communication style. So just to wrap up with some key takeaways here, effective communication is really important in any workplace. It'll enhance your workplace morale. People will feel part of a team, and that is going to lead to more engaged employees, and overall it's going to boost productivity. Less time on follow-up emails, follow-up questions. You'll actually get more things done. People will be more bold in wanting to present new ideas. And in order to do this, you really need to balance your active listening skills. You need to practice thoughtful speaking, as well as make mindful use of nonverbal gestures. And also be aware of potential barriers to effective communication. You're not going to be able to control all of them, right? Like today, I had a bad internet connection. That's not something under my control, but yeah, I can just try to make the most of it. And that's what I encourage you guys to do as well. Just make the most of what you can and just control what you can. And just remember that skill development takes time. The human brain is very plastic and it can learn things well into adulthood. Just because you're of a certain age doesn't mean that you stop learning. Our starting lines are very different though, right? It's important to avoid toxically comparing yourself to others, right? Instead, focus on your own growth. Be better than you were yesterday or last week. Focus on small, achievable goals as you develop your competencies instead of striving for perfection and falling apart at the seams, right? The fact that you all chose to spend this 45 minutes to an hour with me, right? Attending a webinar like this means that you've already taken a big first step. So don't let the start hold you back. Let's keep the momentum flowing. And Sigma is here to help you keep that momentum going. If you're looking for science-based assessments of your strengths and areas for improvement, we have several psychometrically robust assessments that can give you a comprehensive overview of workplace relevant social emotional skills. The Leadership Skills Profile Revised, LSPR, is a fantastic resource for this assessment for this. It assesses communication skills as well as 49 other competencies that are crucial for good leadership. The reports are extremely personalized, providing evidence-backed recommendations for development. Please see our website or contact us if you want more information on this assessment. Sigma also offers a host of talent development opportunities for you, from free resources on our website to individualized coaching, where we can do more than just monologue at you. We can work with some of your your unique challenges and coach you. And if you like what you saw today, our Lunch and Learn seminars are a great next step to building these foundational workplace relevant socio-emotional competencies. So training@sigmaleader.com if you have any questions after the webinar, but we're also going to use this spot to open up the floor to any audience questions. So thank you all for listening, and happy to field any questions. Let's see if my video can work.
Thank you very much, Hiten. Yes, to any of you, feel free to continue posting questions in the Q&A as we go through. I'll start at the top and we'll spend some time going through these together. So Hiten, the first one I have for you is, how can we be kind while still giving constructive feedback?
Right. When I think about this, kindness cannot be taken apart from constructive feedback. In fact, the art of giving constructive feedback indicates that there is a level of trust there, that there is, mutual interest in a shared goal. So when giving feedback to someone, lead with the positives, lead with things that you're happy with, lead with their strengths, and then go into, now these are areas that I'd like for us to improve together. Right? You can give a lot of constructive feedback, and maybe the areas of improvement, maybe that section is a lot longer than the strength section, but you can still make sure that you hammer home the strengths before you go into explaining their areas for improvement. So provide feedback on both of those things, and make sure that you have, again, empathy, make sure you're in their shoes, and give feedback in a way that you would want feedback given to you if you were in a similar position as them.
Thank you. I appreciated what you said about not losing empathy in communication. It's important.
Absolutely.
All right, next up is a small scenario. Our team is not great at active listening. Do you have any advice for how I can encourage others to develop their active listening skills?
We need to, yeah, and that's a good question. And I tend to hear that a lot, especially from friends of mine. And a lot of that sometimes comes down to what motivates them and what incentive factors you're developing around your company, right? Are people incentivized to just talk over each other? Is that behavior more rewarded, right? So what I would do if I was in a position of leadership is pattern of positive reinforcement. I would reinforce active listening habits, people that are able to, for example, soak in other people's points, um, and creating a workplace environment where that's usually a bit more rewarded rather than just, hey, loudest talker in the room gets the most opportunities, right? If necessary, maybe limit speaking times for people during meetings and have a bit more of a structured meeting until you can get to that stage where people are more incentivized to listen. And then, of course, as they're more motivated to develop their listening skills, you can hire a consultant from Sigma, for example, and assess their leadership skills, et cetera. But they're going to have to be motivated in order to, benefit from a lot of these interventions. Definitely start small, start with the incentive structure and work from there would be my suggestion.
I'm going to drop a link in the chat for you all as well. Sigma has free development guides around those leadership competencies that Hiten mentioned in our leadership skills profile assessment. You can download those and take a look. There's always 6 practical tips and activities that you can do to develop skills. So you can use those to have a short team training, those kinds of things, if you're wanting to develop with a group, not just for yourself individually. And you can find the whole set on our website as well.
Absolutely.
All right, so next question is, I'm in a role that doesn't regularly have opportunities for public speaking. How can I make space to practice without waiting for those couple of times of a year when it really matters?
Yes. Well, I gave the active listening homework earlier on in this presentation, right? Practice it in your personal life. Go to a colleague, go to a friend, family member, or even just a shopkeeper who you regularly see and isn't as busy right now, and just ask them about their day and listen take 90 seconds to really listen to them. If you feel your brain deviating, bring it back to the moment. Then ask them, insightful follow-up questions, reflect back what they're talking to you, practice summarizing things. Active listening is really something we can practice day to day. In fact, the day-to-day practice that we do outside of our workplace can have a lot more of a positive impact on our eventual, public speaking skill, regardless of how much time we actually get to speak, at work. A lot of times, a lot of days at work, sometimes I'm, working on spreadsheets. I don't have that many opportunities to communicate, and then other times I'll have plenty of opportunities to talk. Right, so tends to go up and down for me as well. But there's really no excuse not to practice it. We're in a There's 7 billion people in the world, right? We're in an interconnected world, whether you do it at home or whether you do it at work. There's always opportunities to practice. So just try to invest maybe even 90 seconds a day starting right now, and eventually you'll find that these skills they're not going to abandon you. They'll just grow.
Thank you. You gave a great tip during the webinar as well when you said to record yourself. You can hop on a Zoom meeting with yourself and hit record. It's shocking how much you can learn about your own behavior sometimes when you see it on camera.
Absolutely.
All right. How can I practice my nonverbal cues? Similar, but nonverbal this time.
Yeah, and nonverbal gestures would again requires a lot of self-awareness, and this is where I would recommend as well recording yourself, taking stock of your of how you communicate. I tend to move my hands a lot, for example, I notice, and something I'm working on. It's not, hopefully it's not too distracting. And take stock of how much eye contact you're making as well, and solicit feedback from some of your colleagues as well. You're going to have better rapport maybe with some colleagues than others, and those who are more open to you would, they'll tell you, right? If you ask them to be honest about things like, hey, am I making decent enough eye contact? Am I any of my nonverbal gestures making you uncomfortable? Getting this external feedback, either from recordings or from other people, is a really good starting step to then audit your nonverbal behavior. And then, of course, practice being calm, practice having a calm composure through mindfulness, meditation, and things like that will go a long way toward making sure you're more in control of your nonverbal gestures. And then, of course, if you're the one judging, like I said previously, try not to overanalyze other people's nonverbal cues.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have time for one more question before we wrap things up. So let's finish with, what if I work with someone who is not a good communicator? How can I gently encourage them to improve their skills?
Yeah, I've worked with a lot of people who I couldn't establish a rapport with, and the answer is going to be different from individual to individual, right? That's why the concept of individual differences exist. But you're going to have to start with constructive feedback, right? If it's a workplace where you have, say, quarterly performance reviews, make sure you use that time again to tell them about some of the positive things that they're exhibiting, some of their positive workplace behaviors, and then go on to say, however, I feel like we can communicate better. I don't feel like we have as good a rapport as I think we I think we easily could have if we just worked on this, and this. So it would depend. Like, are they poor? Could they improve their listening? Could they improve their nonverbal gestures? Take stock of that, and then try and articulate that, and ask them how they feel about it too. And if you two find some agreement there, then you at least have some common ground to start working on this together, right? But it's all going to have to start with an actual frank conversation with the individual.
Right, that's a really good way to approach it. Thank you, Hiten. Okay, so we are going to cut off the Q&A there. Like Hiten mentioned, please don't hesitate to send us an email if you'd like to follow up about anything that was said, or if you're looking for particular resources, we would be happy to help. I've got a couple of announcements for you before we go. One is, if you would like credit, you can let us know in the poll that I'm about to put up. Give me 1 minute here. We are certified to provide recertification education points. So this webinar is worth 1 professional development credit. So just let us know. You don't need to say no. We just need to know the people who are going to be using this for a professional development credit. I'll leave that up and you can just pop that poll in the corner of your screen. I'll also say that if you liked what you saw here, we do have a couple more webinars happening for the remainder of this year. I will drop the link in the chat for you. You can take a look at Sigma's events page. And if you have a burning desire to see a webinar about a particular topic, please also shoot us an email. We're happy to incorporate the feedback that we get from you. Hiten, if you could roll through the next slide for me, that would be great. Thank you. And just to close, I'll say that when you exit this webinar, you'll see a feedback survey pop up in your browser. We do go through every response that we get and we incorporate the feedback in how we run webinars for the future. So please do take a minute to fill that out. Let us know what you liked, what you didn't like. We would be very grateful for that. And I believe that is all that I have for you today. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. We would like to say a big thank you all for joining us, and thank you also, Hiten, for an excellent presentation. And we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.